Good afternoon. Welcome to Flip Classroom number 7. Today we're going to be talking about the controversy surrounding the Electoral College. Now, we've gone over in class that the Electoral College elects the President of the United States, not the popular vote. The popular vote is what happens on Election Day. So on the second Tuesday of November in 2016 and 2020 and 2024, the country comes together and does one thing together every 4 years. We vote for President of the United States. But each of the 50 states have a different way of doing it. So even though it's at the same time, each of the individual states gets to decide how they go about voting. So on this day, each of the 50 states opens up elections from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. or whatever the state chooses in terms of their time, and people vote throughout the day, and at the end of the day, the votes are counted, and we get a popular vote. At the end of Election Day, we don't get an electoral vote. In fact, the individual state legislatures, after hearing the popular vote, will then certify their electoral vote, however many they have, based on how many congressmen a state has, plus the number of senators they have. So the actual day that the electors from the Electoral College select the president isn't until mid-December. So there's a lag time between the time that the President of the United States is voted for, somebody becomes the presidential or the president-elect, a transition team is chosen, and the next president is sworn in as the commander-in-chief of the United States. So this lame duck period has one important governmental function. The individual state legislators certify the electoral vote. The electoral vote is turned into the United States Congress, and Congress certifies the election of the next president of the United States. Now, if everything goes smoothly on election night, well, this system works. But if something goes wrong with the popular vote, it triggers problems that follow after that. In the election of 2000, this critical time period between Election Day and the inauguration, we saw just about everything that could go wrong actually go wrong on election night. So some important things to note. In the election of 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote, but didn't get enough electoral votes for a win. And in fact, what wound up coming out was one state in particular, the state of Florida, couldn't give an accurate accounting for the electoral votes. And a lot of, almost the perfect storm of American politics contribute to this. First off, the media, as you'll see in this video, early on calls the state of Florida for Al Gore. Now, Florida is considered a big swing state. Florida carries a lot of electoral votes. Al Gore winning Florida influenced the other time zones. At one point, people were able to predict that Al Gore was going to be the next president of the United States. With certain states that had always voted Democratic, they were able to come up with the number 270. So if around Eastern Standard Time, say 8 o'clock, the ABC or CBS or NBC or any of the other major networks, imagine at 8 o'clock they called Al Gore for the next president of the United States. Remember, California, Oregon, Washington, those states are at 4 o'clock in the afternoon still. Time for 4 hours of more voting. So if we looked at Oregon voting patterns changed significantly after the announcement was made that we can project Al Gore to be the next president of the United States. As the Midwest started voting, one has to ask themselves, did Democratic voters stay home because they believed that their vote was no longer at issue? These are things that we can never know, and it brings into question the media's role in projecting who the president of the United States is based on something called exit polls. Now, exit polls are people who stand a certain distance away from voters after they go to their voting booths and come out, and people ask them questions like, what did you care about the most? Who did you vote for? Anything along those lines. So we move on to the state of Florida in the days following the election, and there came all of these issues that came up that said, oh my goodness, how did this actually happen? So one of the first things we saw was that a large number of African Americans in 2000 were told they didn't have the right to vote. They went up, they tried to vote, and voter registrars turned them around. Florida, like many other states, do not allow people who have been convicted of a felony to vote. So in this particular case, people who were not felons showed up to vote, but their names were close to somebody whose name was a felon. So due to an error committed by a private company that was employed by people who were appointed by then Governor Jeb Bush, these people had made a mistake, produced a voter purge list. The voter purge lists were used by the registrar, and the registrar said, you were convicted of a crime, you don't have the right to vote. Meanwhile, people who had no criminal record at all were on this list. So it was a mistake, it was one that shouldn't have happened, and there was no way of correcting it, no way for us to hold a re-election. Elections on election day, and that's it. These people were denied the right to vote. Moreover than that, the idea that this was all being done on good faith didn't sit well with the American public, seeing as President Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, was governor of the state. Then add to that, the manner in which people were voting was called a punch card ballot, where you would take these punch cards, stick a pin through the hole, and pop out, and then there's your punch card ballot. The hole would indicate for George W. Bush or for Al Gore, or for any of the third-party candidates. The system was so old and so antiquated that it didn't work. People were trying to use these pins to push through a ballot that actually would not push through. The machine would indicate that you had, but the cards would come up with no vote. This was the Chad controversy. The name of a punched voter ballot was called a Chad, and you couldn't tell if the punch card had gone all the way through, if there was a dimpled Chad, if there was a hanging Chad, or if there was no punch at all. And then add to that a statewide recount after, because the states voting, even with the voter irregularity, was so close that they had to recount all the votes by hand. And then, of course, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party sent teams and teams of lawyers who objected to every form of recount that there was. Florida was left in a state of disarray, trying to figure out, could they get their voting count done before the safe harbor deadline in December.